All right. Well, we have a president, Obama, who is leading the country to its destruction and to civilization's end, and a party system, the Democratic Party that he belongs to, and the way that the two parties interact, the system under the control of the enemy, the oligarchy of the financiers and the British Crown. This is a long-standing problem in our country and also in European and other history, probably. You have this problem in parliaments. This is the system of parliamentary control, as opposed to our constitutional system. It's not the system of the U.S. Constitution. What we need in our country is a president and a candidate for the presidency who is acting as a sovereign individual and who is speaking to the sovereign reason of the individual citizens, who can then mobilize themselves as a patriotic population in response to an idea that leadership is presenting. Such leadership, positive leadership, is prevented by the financiers and oligarchs' control of the party system. They exercise a veto on any kind of proposals and initiatives that are creative that would interfere with the oligarchical and imperialist system. And it is never arranged so that the party could respond to reality. The party is never in touch with reality. It is only responding to the needs of, or the self-perceived needs of, this oligarchy in a crisis or in the situation it finds itself in. Under the present circumstances, that's a disaster. That's a catastrophe for civilization. When you have had great leadership, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, George Washington, John Quincy Adams, other leaders who were guiding the population in a new way in response to a crisis, in response to a great national need. They never made reference to party in their judgments and in their appeal. They were always thinking in historical terms. They were completely aware of the battle going on over centuries between the side of humanitarian concern, which is a scientific-based idea of mankind. It's mankind's basing the idea of mankind as using science to make progress, and they have a national purpose based in that kind of thinking. And these are creative individuals. Their personal creativity and their political ideas are not. They did not allow them to be subject to the rule of any political party. George Washington, of course, wasn't a member of any political party. Abraham Lincoln had been a member of two different political parties, the Whigs and the Republicans. When he ran for president in 1864, of course, he wasn't doing that as a member of a party. It was called a fusion ticket. Franklin Roosevelt had to completely overwhelm and defeat the leadership of the Democratic Party to take the Democratic Party's nomination. And the Democratic Party was changed very strongly by Roosevelt. He used certain aspects of it, like that they had a historical connection to workers, unions, and so forth, things like that in the big cities, certain immigrant groups, and so forth. But they also had the Southern racists, they had Wall Street, they had Anglophiles, and so forth. So in every case where leadership is needed The party system has never been the source or even been friendly to the action of a leader or a leadership group that would solve the problem for the population. And Washington was referring to the problem that the two parties that made up the system at that time, the Jefferson Party and the Federalist Party, were attached to foreign powers in their emotions. The Federalists attached to England, the British Empire, and Jefferson attached to France, or the Jefferson Party attached to France. And this was addressed directly in George Washington's farewell address as he left office after his second term. And he warned against foreign influences being exerted on Americans and on the decision-making process in America. Of course, that is the problem to this present day, where you have the British and people associated with them, like Israel or whatever else. But the British Empire and the old, undead, feudal nobility and banking aristocracy of Europe behind the scenes, operating through London and then through Wall Street as well, sort of as a doubly removed thing from London to Wall Street, and exercising foreign influence in the United States. But they do it, much of it, through political parties, not all of it. This referred in George Washington's time to a system that rose up against the constitutional system, starting with the action of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison against the policies of George Washington and his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, against nationalism, against nationalist economics, against the political economy of using national power to develop and change the nation and make it more industrialized and more scientific and so forth. The British Empire opposed this, and the elements within the United States that were misguided. For example, Jefferson and Madison were both, because of their sort of pseudo-aristocratic Southern connections and their education in things like Newton and Locke, they were tied to certain kinds or certain aspects of British philosophy. And even though they didn't like the British Empire, so they're not aware of why they thought the way they did, why Madison was thinking like a Malthusian and why Jefferson was for free trade. They attacked Hamilton instead of attacking George Washington, who was so popular with the public. But they attacked Hamilton to get at these policies. The people who associated themselves with that attack at the beginning were not misguided patriots. Aaron Burr and Albert Gallatin, both of them foreign spies. Albert Gallatin being from an anti-American aristocratic family in Switzerland, and Aaron Burr being, by the evidence, a British asset and increasingly a British covert action agent in the United States from very early in his life. They all participated together in the attack on the Washington administration, on Alexander Hamilton. And as people know, Aaron Burr ended up killing Alexander Hamilton and was later tried for treason by Jefferson. So that combination really was unstable. But there were problems with the Washington administration. There were problems especially with the party associated with Washington. But guess what? That's not Washington's party. What happened was that people in New England and New York in particular, but some other places as well, who were Tories, who were more identified with the British side in the Revolution, began to say that Jefferson was the devil. They didn't seem to say that Burr was the devil. Jefferson was the devil, and we patriots, we lovers of George Washington, hate this Jefferson who is a communist and an atheist. And therefore, we are going to constitute ourselves a party. And we're going to make this party all around Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. And we will call ourselves Federalists, to associate ourselves with those people who defended the federal Constitution back in 1788 in the fight over ratifying the Constitution. Completely false identification. And since Jefferson is for the French Revolution, we are for the British Empire. And anyway, aren't we all white people who want to associate with Anglo-Saxons? And so forth. And this was a completely false construct where Jefferson was for free trade and the people in the New England Federalists were for breaking up the Union and excluding those parts of the Union that Jefferson had influence in, and so forth. They were not, in principle, in the same point of view as Hamilton. But now you look at the geometry. You have people associating with Jefferson, and they begin to direct their attack not just against Hamilton, but against the Federalist Party, who are getting prominent positions in the government and in power. And they say, look, these people are British associated. They want to turn us back to monarchy. So many, many patriots began to associate with Jefferson because they didn't want to be associated with the British Empire. So it was a setup. And it was that setup that George Washington attacked in his farewell address in 1797. At that time, the time of great national pride in a program that was put forth for developing industry by national patronage and standing up to the British Empire and spreading that news all over the world, there were no parties, not effectively. There were names of parties. There were certain organizations, but they were discredited. Everybody was in with Monroe. Everybody who was anybody was in with Monroe. There was a small minority of Tories that were still left. So it was against this situation that was threatening to the enemy that they got Aaron Burr, again, back from England, where he had, ran away to after his killing and his treason trial. And they got his protege, Martin Van Buren, and they put together a new system, a new party, which they called the Democratic Party. And this backed, in the 1828 election, it backed Andrew Jackson for president. And he was elected as part of a new system of parties. At that time, there was only one party, that new party, because there hadn't been any parties before. In reaction to this party, which took down all the national protection, took down the Bank of the United States, took down the tariffs, played a game with the Southern secessionists to allow them to take down the tariffs, to kick out the Indians, to do all kinds of terrible damage to our country. In reaction to this treason of Jackson and his backers, using this fool Jackson, his rage ball, being run by these British agents, in reaction to that, Henry Clay and other people put up a strong opposition, which came to be called the Whig Party. And it was rotten. It was not a successful party. It had elements of Southern slave owners all over it. John C. Calhoun, after he stopped being a nationalist and was a Southern secessionist, was one of the leaders of the Whig Party. In New York, you had Wall Street bankers in the Whig Party. And they said, oh, well, we don't approve of slavery. Or, we do approve of slavery, but we're in Henry Clay's party. And these people were totally immoral thugs. Henry Clay and certain other people were, precious, patriotic, and creative people. But they weren't that because they were part of the Whig Party. The Whig Party, for various reasons, in some parts, put forward ideas coming from a Henry Clay or coming from an Abraham Lincoln out in Illinois. But that's not what the party was, or that's not how it functioned in this so-called war between the parties. The enemy controlled this, and the country descended in this terrible so-called contest between the Democrats and the Whigs into the control of Wall Street and the Southern slave owners, to the point where the country was almost ended in the 1850s. A new party was formed just to get out of that, called the Republican Party in the 1850s. And, Lincoln was elected, but he didn't care much for the Republican Party. He just, he was elected and he led the country. So you have these two great points of damage. One is the initial formation of the parties, which is a system. It's not just Jefferson. It's the system of the Jefferson Party versus the Federalists, both of them wrong, and fighting in an arena that's like a little fishbowl. In the fishbowl, the water and the heating and everything of that tank is run by the British. And the Patriots, and Americans are part of that. They get into it. Many Patriots are in either one of those parties. Most of the Patriots were with Jefferson, as wrong as they were on economic theory and so forth. But Washington wanted to get out of that. So that's one. The next thing is the formation of the Jackson charade, to get elected as a war hero and then destroy the government on behalf of the British. And people voted for Jackson because he was a hero in the war against the British. Caveat emptor. Buyer beware. You could really say that Franklin Roosevelt was assassinated. He died of natural causes. That is, he died in the battle of World War II and of his leadership. He's fighting fascism at home and abroad, in war and in politics. The politics I'm talking about is not Republican, but the fascists in Wall Street, literally fascists, backers of the enemy. So in 13 years, 12 and a half years of presidency, he was worn out. He was killed by that. But a coup was put up against him by the British and their followers, beginning as soon as they saw that their man, Hitler, who had become not their man when he went against them, at least against their base in England, that as soon as they saw that he was going to lose, this is in 1943, when you had the big battles in Russia. And then you had the decisive Normandy invasion, but this coup against FDR started before that, in 43, when Sumner Wells was forced out by a slander operation. I'll call it a homosexual. He was the main foreign policy advisor. And other things whereby Wall Street and London openly identified with Hitler and Mussolini, not to speak of Tojo, before the war and some of them right through the war, and all associated with the enemy. They're putting up a vice around Roosevelt. So when Roosevelt died, Truman, who had been forced on the ticket in 1944, the election ticket as the vice president, becomes president, and through such people as Averell Harriman and Dean Acheson in the State Department, who are in various ways directly associated with the British enemy, in conjunction with Winston Churchill personally, and the British ambassador operating in Washington. The Democratic Party administration of Harry Truman betrayed and abandoned and perverted and attacked the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt from before he was dead, but also from the instant that he died. One example of that is what happened in Iran, for example, where FDR had a plan, on paper, already announced plan within the administration to make Iran the development model for the world, with U.S. help and advisors to transform it with industry. And this was attacked while FDR was still president. This is all behind the scenes, but the documents are there by Acheson and this crowd. And after he died, the new administration began working directly with the British, merged the intelligence and security apparatus. And this is the Democratic Party with the British government and British security services. And then under Winston Churchill's personal guidance, all the way up to 1952, in day-to-day consultation with the British ambassador in Washington, the United States under Harry Truman organized the mechanism for a coup d'etat against the government of Iran, led at that time by Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the oil of Iran. What oil was it? It was the British Petroleum Company, known in those days as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, then changed their name to British Petroleum. And they took over that company. They were an anti-communist government. And this government of Harry Truman and Acheson and Harriman used the CIA together with MI6, the British intelligence service, to have a violent overthrow of the Iranian government and put fascists back in control of it and try to exercise control over the Shah. The Shah later on, by the way, began associating himself with certain people in Europe, like Mattei in Italy, to get oil through a different route. And eventually this crowd tired of the Shah for that reason. So what became the Democratic Party? What was the Democratic Party? Well, it's something that is run on a day-to-day basis in the elections and in the administration by London and Wall Street. And they have to take into consideration elements that had been in the Democratic Party under Roosevelt, that he had put together as a coalition, like black people, like labor unions, like immigrants, like farmers, or what have you. They have to take those groupings into consideration and think about how they can be mollified and kept in their place so that we can put through the program to ruin and destroy the country. And that's what they've done. It's just like the Wall Street people took over railroads and ruined and destroyed them. It's very simple. They never built any railroads. So this party never built anything. Anything they initiated as a party, such as in the period of the 1970s after the 60s Cultural Revolution, the same Cultural Revolution here as in China. What reforms did they put through? They said, we're not about raising up the population anymore. We're not about changing the condition of the poor throughout the world. We're not about achieving peace in the world. They didn't say that, but that's what they did. And they colored this by certain flavors, like candy or perfume flavors. We're for rights. You have the right to die, to commit suicide, to smoke marijuana, whatever. You can have, you can, if you're gay, you can get married. We'll let you get married on a gay basis. But don't expect to have a decent standard of living. What about peace? Well, we believe that all nuclear science should be canceled because nuclear science goes to, bombs. And also, if nuclear science gets in the wrong hands, it'll be dangerous. So we need to have a war for peace. You get it? And so forth. So that's the party system that we have today. You would not have this problem if you had the kind of leadership that has come up in the past to save the country. Such leadership cannot come up under the constraints of the party system. You have to break that system of constraints to be successful.